All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to another edition of Deconversion Stories, and today I'm talking with Dragons in Genesis. He has a podcast, as you can see in his name over there, and there are links to that below, and there are also links to his Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. So if you like what you hear tonight, you can then follow him wherever the links lead you to. So you definitely check out the podcast. I recommend it. It's very good. So. Anyways, basically what I do is I talk to people about their journeys out of their previous belief systems into becoming the atheists slash activists or whatever as they are today. So Dragons, why don't you sort of take us back to the beginning when you were in a belief system and how you sort of, the dominoes falling and you find your way out of it into who you are, I guess, today then.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in South Louisiana, which pretty much means I was a Catholic by default. Now, my mother, she converted to Catholicism, so she was like an uber Catholic. And of course, if you're from Louisiana and you're also Catholic, that means you have a large family. I am one of 8 boys, so.
Wow.
Yeah, that basically means that my mother is a saint. So we all of us somehow survived, despite our best efforts. But I was raised Catholic, and I was devout. I was in church every Sunday. I was in confession like every other week.
No, really? For what?
Just being human, basically. I mean, look, Catholics, like, most people don't really understand Catholicism, and for all the Protestants out there and all the people who are raised without belief, what you have to understand about Catholicism is that they have taken guilt and turned it into a business. I mean, it is part of their business model. I mean, you are raised, from a very small child to believe that you were born flawed and everything you do makes you more flawed. And in order to not burn in hell, you have to lock yourself in a dark room with an authority figure, get down on your knees, openly confess every horrible thing you've ever done, and then beg forgiveness, and then go out and basically try to, do good works to repent for that. And this starts at age 7. Okay, it is a business model. Okay, and they, of all the major religions, they are the best at sort of weaponizing guilt. Okay, and so you kind of have to understand that to understand any deconversion from any Catholic, is that you're raised with guilt and shame as just part of your life, and it is deeply ingrained in you. And so I was one of these people who was like, ashamed of everything. You do anything, well, you got to go and beg forgiveness for that. And so that's basically who I was. But I took it a step further. I wanted to be extremely active in the church, and I was. I was co-founder of the youth group at my church. I helped staff retreats. I gave talks. I was studying to become a catechism teacher. On and on.
Wow.
And on. Okay, I was, and this was by the time I was like 20. Okay. So like my Friday nights, whenever I was like 20, 21, all the way to like 24, was spent at church. Okay. That's what I did like every Friday night. I'd get off work and I'd go spend an hour or two at church. And then if I still had time and any of my friends were still awake, I'd go and hang out with them. And that was for years. And so that's basically who I was. And somewhere along the way, this was a couple months after I graduated high school, I began to suffer from depression. And if you're a Catholic and you're suffering from depression, it's kind of odd, because it means that either you did something wrong and you're being punished for it, or this disease, this illness, this pain is part of a plan. It means something. It has a purpose. and you have to find a way to use your illness for some kind of good, because it's all part of this plan. And suffering is, I mean, you're ingrained with this. Suffering is a good thing. I mean, just look at Mother Teresa, you
Yeah.
know, torture people because it's good to suffer. And so my depression, it wasn't an illness. This was a blessing. I mean, it didn't matter that I almost died, like, actually, it was like 22 years ago, almost to the day. So it was like 2 days ago would have been exactly 22 years ago was the first time I almost died. And that's a good thing, because it's good to
How,
suffer, you
how,
know.
how'd you almost die, though?
My family, they were all away from home, and I went into the bathroom with a knife, and I opened my wrist, and I basically sat down with my hands over the sink with the water running. That way my mom wouldn't have a mess to clean up when she got home. I was gonna die. And during the process of this, when I became like lightheaded and kind of disoriented from blood loss, um, I looked in the mirror, and for a brief second, I thought I was looking at my younger brother. One of my younger brothers looks very similar to me. If you
Mm.
see photos of him and me when we're the same age, you actually have to look at our clothing to say, "Oh, okay, that was the '90s, you know, not the 2000s. So okay, that's Jason, that's not Nathan." Okay, we look that similar. And so when you're kind of disoriented because you've been bleeding for 10 minutes, you don't see straight. And so I looked in the mirror, and for a split second I saw his face. And I
Wow.
had this horrible idea that he was going to come in and find me. And then suddenly I couldn't do it. I had to stop, not for myself, but for him.
Mhm.
And if you're cut deep, it's difficult to stop, especially if you're already weak from blood loss. It was a huge mess. I eventually got it to stop. I got everything cleaned up. I had to hide all the rags in a trash bag, and I was going. I was like sneaking into my room as my family was pulling into the driveway. So I
Mhm.
basically almost got caught, and yeah, it was horrible.
But didn't they notice the cuts at all, or
No,
did you
no,
wear stuff to cover it
I
up?
kept them hidden. No one knew for years. It was
Okay.
years before anyone found out that I even had depression. I mean, like many depressed people, we're good at hiding it.
Mm,
You, I
it's
don't know.
true.
It's just we just do it. Um, Actually, I got a watch with a really wide band that I wore. I was wearing long sleeve shirts a lot, and which is odd for Louisiana, but people do strange things sometimes. So no one really took any notice. And so yeah, it was years before anyone found out. And so that was basically my life. I was hiding my depression. I was hiding multiple suicide attempts. I had two friends that knew, and that was only because they sort of found out accidentally. One of them walked in the middle of an attempt and stopped me.
Mm.
And so that actually happened a couple times. Uh, but somewhere along the way, while I was staffing this youth group, I I'd been sort of going to counseling with a sort of Catholic counselor of sorts. Um, get real counseling, people. Don't go to religious people for medical reasons. They're don't do it. Um, And I was basically led to believe, I think at this point I was maybe about 20. So I'd been suffering from depression for about 2 years. And I was sort of led to believe, or at least my belief that this was meaningful in some way was reinforced, and it had a purpose. My suffering was a gift. And I don't recall how much of this was the counselor's idea and how much I filled in on my own, but essentially, I came to the conclusion that I needed to use my disease to try to help people.
Okay.
And so, as part of Working with the youth group, I wasn't just giving talks on like faith and theology and things like that. I've been studying, theology long before my podcast. Um, but I started giving talks on depression, and the people in the youth group at that point knew, but my family, they still didn't know. It was still quite a while before they ever found out. Um, and since my phone number as one of the administrators for this group was public, that meant that despite my best efforts, I had depressed teenagers calling me in the middle of the night sometimes. I would give a talk at a youth group, and then maybe a week or a month later, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone would ring. And then I'm suddenly half asleep on the phone with someone who got their dad's gun. They got some sleeping pills. They have a knife, whatever. Most of them were not in the process of making an attempt, but there were quite a few that were. And these conversations were hard. I was not prepared for this. I didn't want this. I never encouraged anyone to call me with these types of problems. I worked at a print shop. I actually got information, from like the National Suicide Hotline and stuff, and printed out like basically like brochures to give out every time I did one of these talks. It had the National Suicide Hotline. Had the phone number on there. It had websites for resources, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to help. I may have been sort of misguided, but I wanted to help people. And I kind of believed that was the best way to do it. And I wanted to send people in the right direction, so they would go to someone who was qualified to discuss it. But you still end up answering the phone and talking to people who are hurting. And I would do my best to just help. And I would always get them to like go find someone and get someone else there. I would not let them off the phone until I heard someone else's voice. And it's like, look, you have to start telling them about this problem before I'm going to hang up. And, sometimes it would take 20 minutes. Sometimes it would take 3 or 4 hours. But eventually they would go wake up their parents or whomever, and they would start having the conversation before, I would let them hang up. And they would end up in counseling, on medication, whatever. And over the course of a few years, I probably had about a dozen serious phone calls, give or take. And every single one of them basically got help. And I saw that as a sort of reinforcement of this idea that my suffering had some kind of meaning. It had purpose,
Sure.
And again, as misguided as that sounds, when you wake up every morning wanting to die, having that as a purpose, no matter how false it might be, can get you through the day. And many days, that's the reason that I survived, was because in my head, someone might need to hear my story. And it did help some people. And every single one of them that came to me for help, I guess I helped them, except the last one.
Oh, I was going to ask, how did you find out that what you had done had helped them? Did they tell you? Or?
Yeah, because a lot of these were kids that I knew, because while I did go to different youth groups, I went to a lot of these youth groups, in the area on a fairly regular basis, even if they weren't at my church and part of my youth group. And so, I recognize these voices. I give a talk, in Moss Bluff or Lake Charles or something, and there's 50 or 60 kids, and I know 30 of them, and I hear one of them's voice a week later on the phone. I knew who it was, and often I knew. Sometimes I knew who was going to call me, before the meeting was even over, because when you're hurting like that, sometimes you can see it in other people, you can see it in their eyes because you see it in yourself. And that also kind of played into this idea that this disease had purpose, that my depression was a good thing because it was like, a silver lining. I can use that to help someone else. And so then I would check in with them, after one of these phone calls, the next time I saw them at a meeting or something. And so, yeah, I actually, there were a couple that I've actually kind of kept in touch with over the years, and they're still doing all right. And so, yeah,
Good.
they eventually, got the help they needed. There was one night I was at a bookstore. I was always at this one bookstore. If you wanted to find me, I was at this bookstore.
Or church.
Right. When I wasn't at work or helping out at church, then I was at this bookstore. I literally had people call the coffee shop and ask for me. And the people at the coffee shop were like, "Hey, Jason, you got a phone call." Yeah, I was like Norm from Cheers, so yeah, if you wanted to find me, that's where you went. But one day, this one guy, he was also kind of part of the staff at the youth group, and he was co-founder of a different youth group that I had been to a few times. And he didn't normally come into the store, but he came in there one day, turned right, made a beeline for me, and we sat there and hung out for about an hour. We talked about color calibration. I worked in the printing industry. He worked in the paint industry.
Okay.
And while there's like no overlap, the way that you calibrate, printers or these machines that add pigment to the paint, things like that, it's like the same equipment you use to calibrate them. And we had like an hour-long conversation about color calibration, which only people in the industry could have that kind of conversation. But I'll never forget it because that's the last time I spoke with him. Because right after that conversation, he left and he killed himself.
Oh, wow.
And I found out Monday morning when a coworker walked in and asked if I knew the guy who had died over the weekend. And then she got online and she pulled up his obituary. And I realized that I was the last person to speak with him. And I didn't know what to do because everything I had been led to believe over the last like 4 years was that I had this disease so that I could help people. And that was like God's plan for me. I had to suffer so that I could be better equipped to see the same problem with other people so that I could relate to them. I could help them. I could get them moving in the right direction to get help. And all of the times that I gave these talks, all the times that my phone rang, that had all just reinforced this. And then when it mattered most, when the guy was sitting 2 feet away from me, a guy I had known for years, one of my friends, who never went to this store but knew I was there, I had to wonder, did he go there that night looking for me? Did he go there looking for help? Probably not. He probably just went into the bookstore to buy a book and he saw me and went and talked to me. But when you think that you were put on this earth to help people who have the same disease you do, because that's what you've been told, and you're like 24 years old and you don't know any better, and you've also been raised with guilt your entire life, you can't help but make that connection. And honestly, I thought I'd killed him. I mean, it fucked me up because
what would have made you think that?
A combination of factors. I mean, At the time, I thought that if someone needed help, if someone was depressed, if someone was that close to the edge, that I should be able to see it because
Mhm.
I had been there. And I
Sure.
mean, like I said, I thought that was my purpose. I thought that was my one reason for being on earth, was to experience this so I could then use it to help other people.
Sure.
And then when it mattered most, I spent an hour talking about color calibration on digital printers.
Yeah, but how would you
It's
know that he was depressed, like, outside of that
right.
conversation? It just seems so
And
normal.
right. And that was something I began struggling with because, I mean, he died right after we had this conversation. Like within a few hours of us parting ways, he was dead.
Wow.
And not long after I find out about this, and I have this conversation, like this, like, I don't know, like 8:10 in the morning on a Monday, my coworker shows me this obituary, and I dropped down into my chair. I felt sick. I felt like I was going to puke. And I just said, look, I have to leave. And I left.
Mm.
And I went home and I was sitting in my apartment and I have this just playing over and over and over in my head for hours. What did I miss? There had to be a sign, something that I had to have seen to tip me off. I mean, that's how it works, right? That's my purpose. I have to see it so that I can help. He didn't say anything.
Mhm.
So there had to have been some kind of clue, and there wasn't. There was nothing I could have seen because we're good at hiding it.
Right.
And just as at this point, I mean, I had so many scars. I had vomited up so many sleeping pills at this point, and yet no one around me, with the exception of those two friends, no one knew that I was going through that. And here I was trying to figure out why I couldn't see it in someone else. And it kind of started to click. Maybe I wasn't special. Maybe there wasn't a purpose. Maybe I was just sick.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do with that. Because if that was the case, then there's no plan. I mean, the only alternative is the plan was for me to be led to believe this just so I could feel worse when my friend died.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if that's the case, then whatever God came up with that plan is evil.
Yep.
And those were the thoughts going through my head for several days. And I go to his funeral, and um, after the funeral, um, I go home, and I'm laying in bed, and I'm trying to figure out what to do, because suddenly this one argument that I've had to basically keep going, the idea that people might need me because I might have some kind of purpose, that I might be able to use this, my own disease to help out other people, that had been kicked out from under me. And so I didn't know what to do. And I didn't know if I had a purpose. And this was a purpose that many days was literally keeping me alive. And so I was again contemplating, another attempt. Um, and somewhere along the way, that day, the afternoon after his funeral, I'm lying in bed and I get this question. Why is it no longer a sin to commit suicide?
Hmm.
Well, for centuries, the Catholic Church taught that if you committed suicide, you committed murder. And since you died, there was no ability to repent, to go to confession, to be absolved. So you would go straight to hell.
Hmm.
But we have this book. It's about that thick. It's called the Catholic Catechism, and it is all the doctrine of the Catholic Church. This is what you believe. So you don't even need the Bible. All you need is this one book, and it's like one topic after another. What's their stance on cremation? Oh, we'll just turn to chapter 43 and it'll tell you suicide? Oh, well, 36, it'll tell you. And I had read this book. I mean, I was training to become a catechism teacher. Suicide was no longer a sin. It was just recognized as the terminal result of a mental illness. So could that change? How could it be a sin one day and then another day it's not? I mean, how does that work? Did God change his mind? And if that's the case, then what is wrong today that'll be okay tomorrow? Like, did all those people actually go to hell? And if so, did they get let out after God changed his mind? And so these questions kind of step in. And I decided that I couldn't kill myself until I found the answer, because I didn't want to go to hell. And so I went to my priest. And how is this no longer a sin? How could this change? How can the morality of the all-powerful creator of the universe switch in order to catch up with modern medicine and the study of mental disease?
Right.
And I got these kind of dismissive, non-committal answers. And so I went to the one place that Catholics don't really go. I went to the Bible. If there was an answer, it's got to be in there, right? I mean, that's got the answer to everything.
Well, so they say.
Right? And this isn't really a disparaging remark against Catholics. So much of Catholic doctrine just doesn't come from the Bible. And so most Catholics just don't read it. But I did. I grabbed my Bible and I started reading. And here's an awesome thing about Catholic Bibles. They have amazing footnotes, and they have 7 extra books that contain some pretty cool stuff. So I'm reading my Bible. I mean, I had read bits and pieces, but I had never started at Genesis 1 and just read it. And by the time I get to Genesis 7, the Noah's flood, I notice that there's a problem. He takes 2 of each animal on the ark, and then he takes 14. It's like, what the hell? And then, where does the water come from? The sky or the ground? How long does the rain last? How long does the flood last? What birds does he send out? And it's got all these problems. And while I'm looking at these different I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, how did the sloths from South America get there?
Right. But even just in the details it presented, it's like one sentence is literally contradicting the next. And so I look at the footnotes, and it tells me something about these different sources. That the Genesis 7, the Noah's flood story, it's a composite of 2 different flood stories. What?
Yeah.
There was only one flood. How do you have 2 different stories? And didn't Moses write this? What, did he write it and then forget and write it again? And it's talking about these different sources. And I'm like, what the hell's a priestly source? And what the hell's the documentary hypothesis? So I went back to the priest. And then I really got a non-committal answer. Oh, yeah, maybe this, you really should just not worry about that. Just look for the moral of the story and what it means to you. And, that's really for the priest, the clergy to worry about. It's not for the congregation.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that sounds like you're hiding something. Well, at this time, I had a friend who was in the seminary. He was training to become a priest. He didn't make it. He liked girls too much, so it wasn't going to work out. Yeah, he's got a family. He has almost as many kids as my parents had. But he was in the seminary at the time, and he's over at the house one day, and I'm kind of feeling him out because it's like every time I brought these questions to the clergy, I got these really strange answers. Like they wanted me to just stop asking questions.
Yeah.
So what I did with him was, instead of asking him about these things, I started asking him what kind of books he has to study in seminary. And he went to the same seminary that my priest went to. So he's telling me about some of these books and how much he hates this one book and how much this other book is so enlightening and all this other stuff. And in the back of my head, I'm keeping track of these titles. And after he leaves, I grab my computer with my 28K modem, where the internet made noise before it starts up. And I get on eBay and I find some of these books and I order them. This is a puzzle. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. My OCD says I have to untie the knot. And I get these books and it starts talking about the documentary hypothesis and how a great deal of the Old Testament was assembled in stages by multiple sources that often contradicted each other and even argued against each other. And no one even knows who wrote any of the books of the Bible, and on and on and on. And I'm thinking, I ask these questions and they know the answers and they won't tell me. This is lying. I know what lying is. It's one of the commandments.
Mm-hmm.
This is lying. But I still don't have my answers. So I keep reading. I keep reading the Bible. I keep reading this course material for the Catholic seminary. And I have more questions. So I start looking for answers, and that leads me to more books, and that leads me to more questions. And somewhere along the way, I realized that when I was reading the Bible, I was reading mythology. Like, I took mythology in high school. I knew what mythology was.
Yep.
Mythology was that different stuff. That was the false religions that people no longer believe. That's the made up crap. I have the real religion, the good stuff, the truth. Only I didn't. I had a big book full of myths.
Mm-hmm.
And I still believe. Because this was the Old Testament, and that doesn't really matter because Jesus was real. And that's the part that matters. So we don't follow the Old Testament. So if Moses was just fake and based off of older myths, and if by the time Joshua would have reached Jericho, it would have already been a giant pile of rubble, so he never actually attacked it. Well, that doesn't matter either, because those are just stories. And like my priest said, you should just look for the moral of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But then I got to the New Testament, and none of the Gospels agreed on anything. Oh, well, did Jesus' parents live in Bethlehem? And he was born in Joseph's house, and then they fled to Nazareth? Or did they live in Nazareth and they went to Bethlehem and they had to go into a cave because there was no room at the inn and he doesn't have a house? What? These are two completely different stories.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the way, while I'm reading the New Testament, I realized that I didn't believe in Jesus either. And that was kind of scary because I realized that this thing that I had grown up to hate and fear, the atheist, I had become one at some point in the past, in the last weeks or months, somewhere along the way of reading this book. My belief in a deity had just vanished. It was like incense smoke drifting up to the ceiling. It dispersed and it faded, and I couldn't point to the time that it happened. I just knew that it had happened, and I had been a non-believer for a while when I realized this.
So you basically, you kind of were one, but didn't realize, and then you had that little mini epiphany of the fact that you already were one because of all this.
Yeah, at some point I realized I'm not a believer anymore. And then I realized it had been maybe months since I had actually believed. It was just a gradient, and at some point I had gone from white to black, but I never noticed a change because it was just slightly varying shades of gray. And so each day was like any other until one day it was completely different. But I still had a question. How did these stories get into this book?
Mhm.
Which means I had more reading to do. And so I started reading more. I didn't. Suddenly the book wasn't that important, or it was important, maybe more important, but in a whole different way, because
Right.
this wasn't a guide for my life. This wasn't a thing that I believed. This wasn't a thing that was sacred. But this was that same fun mythology I had in high school. This was Zeus and Hera and Osiris and Dionysus. And I was like, this is now fascinating for entirely different reasons. There aren't answers in here, there are questions.
Mhm.
And suddenly, I kind of fell in love with the Bible. And so, right? It was just like any other book. But this book was a mystery. And so the divinity, the sacredness of this text was gone, but it was replaced by this profound curiosity.
Mhm.
And so I went and I got some more books to read. Because I found this book. It was like the Bible for Dummies. I'm like, oh, this is going to tell me where the books came from. Don't bother with that big yellow thing. It's a paperweight. Just toss it. So I found some other books. And I found some other books. And when one book would answer a few questions, it would raise a dozen more. So I had to get more books. And pretty soon I realized I was obsessed. And somewhere along the way, I discovered Robert M. Price and the Bible Geek podcast. And half the questions people asked, I couldn't even understand the question, let alone the answer. And I'm like, there is so much that I don't know. Like, I've read a ton of books, and I am maybe more ignorant than when I started. So I got more books. And then I got more books. And then I filled up a bookshelf. And the more I read, the more notes I took, the more I learned, the more I realized that this thing was so incredibly complicated that if I spend the rest of my life trying to untie the knot, it will still be a giant Gordian knot when I die. And then I realized I was fine with that because it was fun. And so the last 12 years of my life have been spent picking at this book, untangling these little mysteries, and just reading the works of people like Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman and Margaret Barker, and on and on and on. And the stack of books gets bigger, and my to-be-read list gets even bigger. And somewhere along the way, I guess my girlfriend got tired of hearing me prattle on about stuff I had learned about the Bible. So I figured I'll just start a podcast and prattle to anyone who's stupid enough to listen. And so I'm a truck driver. And so one day I was in Kankakee, Illinois. I parked this little, it's not really a truck stop. It's a gas station with a gravel lot behind it. I parked down there and I go 3 or 4 miles away. I go into town. I go to this Best Buy and I buy a microphone. I spent like $120 on a Blue Yeti, and I take it back to my truck. I plug in my laptop and I record the worst episode in the history of podcast. Absolute garbage. And I was so fucking proud of this episode. I was like, yeah, I'm going to just tear down people's faith. They get one load of this and they will be instantly deconverted because I'm going to show people, look, your beliefs, they're just a bunch of stupid myths. And you go through like the first dozen episodes of my show, and every 5 seconds, it's like, oh, yeah, there's the angry atheist. Let me just fast forward through that crap. And somewhere along the way, I get into the story of Abraham and I'm talking about the different parallel myths and things that inspired it. And I kind of forget to tell you that your religion is bullshit. And I'm just having fun with the mythology again. And by the time I finish Abraham, I realized that I didn't even care about religion anymore. I just liked the stories. And so whenever I finished Genesis, my plan was to just do the podcast until Genesis. I was going to finish up Genesis. That's why the name is Dragons in Genesis. It was just going to be the one book. And I had followers at that point, as maybe like 3 of them or something. I don't know. And they liked the show. As bad as it was, they liked it. And they're like asking questions. And I'm like, I got to do the next book. And so I went on to Exodus. And Moses was fun. The research for that cat. Oh, I read this fantastic book by Jan Assman. It's called Moses the Egyptian. And it talks about all this Egyptian cultural influence on the Exodus story and all this fascinating stuff. And I had so much fun that by the time I got done researching Moses, I had fallen in love all over again. I was hooked. I was re-addicted to the Bible. And that was a couple of years ago. And at this point, I think if I did try to stop, my listeners would just lynch me. But I don't think I will. I'm having too much fun with it. The stories are amazing. And I just like digging into the mythology. I love trying to untangle this knot and just discovering all these neat details, all these different myths that are either parallel to it or that contributed to these Bible stories. And so here I am today, prattling on about the Bible.
You got a fan right there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I was on Brainbug earlier today, and again, was it earlier this month or last month? I lose track of time. Talking about Bible monsters, which there are some cool monsters in the Bible. So if you don't know about Bible monsters or the fact that they have like kaiju in the Bible, go to Brainbug's channel, check it out.
Yeah,
Bible
I saw a bit of
monsters.
that earlier.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I love is that like there are friggin' dragons in the Bible. You know, there's all kind of cool things. There's a giant cow that's like the size of a mountain range. There are kaiju cows in the Bible. That's cool shit. And that's what I talk about. It's cool stuff like that you don't learn about in Sunday school, and a lot of boring stuff like all the begats. I don't skip any of it.
Oh, yeah.
I do the whole thing, including the genealogies and stuff like that. I won't read the whole genealogy at you, but I will point out like problems with it, contradictions, where it parallels other myths and things like that. So yeah, that's basically how I went from devout Catholic to someone who just likes the stories about monsters.
Do you know this person that posted something there? Right?
Oh yeah, she is a source of like 85% of my headaches and my greatest emotional support, and a major contributing factor to the reason that I haven't had a suicide attempt in a dozen years. So
Wow, cool.
yeah, she is important. And there probably isn't anything in my life as important as her. So, except maybe my dog, but she gets it.
So what are you drinking, by the way?
I think it's like Founders Brewing double chocolate coffee oatmeal stout. It's
That's a mouthful.
right. It's basically just liquid dessert. It's fantastic. The weather's cooling off, so it's time for some stouts and porters.
Yeah, I agree. I like the stouts and porters, especially the coffees and chocolate ones.
Yeah.
They're really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get a peanut butter chocolate stout. Because my girlfriend's never had one, and those are amazing. There's a company in Austin, Infamous Brewing, that has a peanut butter stout it's out of this world. And so if you're in Austin, look for Infamous, find I think it's like a peanut butter or peanut butter chocolate stout. Try it. It is mind blowing, and their Hefeweizen is great too.
Well, yeah, I will be in Austin. Well, hopefully, depends on how this whole COVID thing pans out, right?
Right.
Because of course I was supposed to be at Faithless Forum again this past early summer, but of course they delayed it because of COVID, right? And I was even going to be a speaker on the panel and stuff like that. So
yeah,
they're going to try again for next June and see how, whether or not that'll go. So we'll see. But I had quite a few good beers when I was down in Austin. Of course, when you're hanging around Aaron Raw, you always have good beers because he likes to pick out some really good stuff from the local breweries and bring it around with him in a gigantic cooler. So
nice. Yeah, I'm lucky because in Louisiana, they're like there's zero good beer. You drink Bud Light or Miller Lite, and that's it. But since I moved to Charlotte, I found that we have like 40 microbreweries in the area, and we have a great selection of beer up here. So, yeah, no shortage of good things to drink in this area.
well, that's good. Good. There's nothing like some good beers to try out. I mean, let's face it. There's like thousands I'd love to try. Whether or not I'll get around to doing it, but I'll try as many as I can before this world is done with me.
Right? Yeah. There's actually a passage I think in Ephesians 9 discussing the meaning of life. It's actually plagiarized from a passage in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where this wine goddess, I think Siduri is her name, basically tells Gilgamesh, it's like, look, life is short, drink it up and have fun. And this basically gets plagiarized and put in almost word for word in Ephesians. So look, the Bible is telling you to drink beer and have fun and don't take life too seriously. And the Bible's the word of God, so you should probably do it. So get on that, man.
Yeah, I don't believe in any gods, so it doesn't matter whose word it is. I'm just going to do it anyways under my own.
There you go.
My own advice. There you go. So, how long has your podcast been running?
About 4 years, I think, somewhere around there.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, guys, there's a link down below so you can follow the podcast if you choose to do so. I've tuned into at least about a dozen of them that I've listened to, and
oh wow,
and I like a lot of the stuff that you talk about, and you bring up some decent points about the ties to the different. Was one episode where you were talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff in it, and the different things that were ripped from that and put into the Bible. Because and you mentioned also that there are many other mythologies in the area that were incorporated in, right? So it's like a grab bag of different things that were put in.
Yeah.
And I found that one to be particularly interesting anyways, but yeah, it's definitely worth a listen because a lot of your stuff is quite interesting. That's for sure.
Yeah. That's basically what the podcast is. I go through the Bible, like starting with Genesis 1, I go through chapter by chapter. And I'll tell you, what the story is about, what the story says, what it means to the greater context of the biblical narrative. And then we'll start breaking down like some of the different contributing myths or parallel myths and show how these stories, they're not unique. These stories are they fit well within the context of Mediterranean mythology. And many of them are actually taken from older sources. And we can actually see that just by studying all these different texts. The example I love using is Noah's flood.
Mhm.
So you look at Noah's flood, and you can basically write this nice, clear outline of what goes on in Noah's flood and, break it down to, about 25 or 30 lines of text to get the whole plot, all the pertinent details. And then if you grab the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is one little section about this man named Utnapishtim. This was actually a whole separate story. Epic of Gilgamesh is sort of like a short story collection.
Mhm.
And the story of Utnapishtim is one that got collected and put in there. And if you read the story of Utnapishtim, when he recounts what happened during the Great Flood, if you write that thing down, all the pertinent details, and make your nice little plot outline like you did with Noah, you essentially have the same story. There are only very few differences, and the differences, it makes sense why they would be there. Like there's a whole morality thing that you find in Noah's flood that isn't present in Gilgamesh. But that makes sense because in the Bible, their God is more concerned with human morality. Whereas in the Epic of Gilgamesh, people are being flooded and killed just because they're being annoying. Okay, morality doesn't play a part. They're not a bunch of sinners. They're just loud, and so the gods kill them. And so it makes sense that this new detail would be in there. But everything else is pretty much the same, including which birds are released and what order they're released in. And so these details are in there. The dimensions of the boat are almost identical. The depth of the flood, everything else, it's listed in there. They're almost identical. And we know because archaeologists actually found a fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh that the Israelites were reading this story centuries before Genesis was ever written. They knew about the story of Utnapishtim, and his flood story.
Right.
But we actually even go back even further than that, because before that we have the myth of Ziusudra and that great flood, which has a lot of the details from Utnapishtim, but not all of them. So Utnapishtim added some onto it.
Yeah.
But even before that, we have the story of Atrahasis. And that came from an actual flood about 5,000 years ago in the city of Shuruppak on the Euphrates River.
Right. Localized flood.
Yeah. It flooded about a half dozen cities. And so this would be something like the Mississippi River flooding, and like half of Iowa going underwater. And to these people who would live and die within sight of the walls of their city, for them, this was the whole world. I mean, and when most people can't swim, even sailors can't swim, this was devastating, And so this flood, a river overflowing its banks, kills a bunch of people. That's a catastrophic event today. But imagine if, in your mind, this was the entire world. This would leave a significant mark on any ancient culture. And it did. Every time there was a major flood somewhere that killed a bunch of people, it generated a flood myth. The Japanese have a flood myth, and in that one, it involves a tsunami because, Japan is prone to tsunamis. Anywhere you go, you're going to find a flood myth because people, they build their cities,
it's quite rivers,
because you kind of need water. I don't know if you know that. I mean, you can't make beer without water, so you have to go near a river. And so you do that, and then one day the river floods and a bunch of people die, and events generate myths. And these myths grow and they evolve, and new details get added. And as they spread to different cultures, that culture adopts them, and it changes that myth into a different myth.
Well, something more suited to their culture. Yes.
Right. The name of the hero gets changed. It becomes a local name. Atrahasis becomes Ziusudra, becomes Utnapishtim, becomes Noah. And the details, they grow and they evolve. But enough of the story remains that, thankfully, we can basically trace this thing back to a time during the end of the Jibdat Nasur period, about 2900 BC, when this river flooded and a couple of cities were inundated, and this tragic event spawned a myth.
Mhm.
And that's basically what I do in the show, is get stuff like that and see how far back we can follow this thread. What myth did it come from, or how many different myths did it come from? Because often it's not that clear cut. It's not Utnapishtim became Noah. It's 5 different people became this one guy. That happens a lot. So
Fantastic. I mean, there's other stories that you could do the same thing with too.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah, actually most of them.
Yeah.
With the story of David and Goliath, there are striking similarities between that and the battle between Achilles and Hector, and also Achilles and Ajax.
Mhm.
And of course, they have these certain changes that occur within the story that are exactly the type of change you would expect a Jewish writer to make. And they have these nifty little reversals. But actually, if you read so in the story of David and Goliath, after he kills Goliath, he desecrates his body by chopping off his head, and then he takes his armor and he brings it back to his tent, which makes no sense at all, because he was just a peasant. He was a shepherd who was passing by the battlefield on his way to go see the king. Why would he have a tent? It makes no sense. Well, because Achilles had a tent. Why does he take the stuff back to it? Well, because Achilles took this stuff back. Why does the battle pause so these 2 champions can come together and fight a thing that didn't actually happen? Well, because Homer wrote about that numerous times. Like every 3rd chapter in the Iliad, everyone stop. These 2 guys who were named characters in our war, they've got to fight, so we're all just going to sit back and eat popcorn. But if you actually read the description, they describe the armor that Goliath wore, which you don't really get descriptions of things like that in the Bible. So when they pop up, they kind of stick out. Well, if you read the description and you compare it to the actual armor that Philistines wore, it doesn't match up. Philistines did not wear that armor. And there's this Jewish scholar, I cannot remember his name.
I've heard. See, I was raised Jewish, so I know these stories very well. I've heard that explained that it was different because Goliath was much larger than the other Philistines, and he had something special designed.
Yeah, I've heard that one too. There's this Jewish scholar, I cannot remember his name. I can eventually find it. I've still got the article somewhere, but he writes this fantastic article outlining the parallels between the David and Goliath story and the Hector and Achilles story. And he shows how the description of Goliath's armor, which, like I said, they don't normally describe things like that in the Bible. It's just, oh, here was this guy. He was from this place, and he was a giant. And then he goes over here and this dude hit him with a rock. That's normally how they do things, and then begat. This guy lived 900 years. And then Yahweh said this. They don't normally say, oh, let me tell you about this armor. Let me describe it in detail. So when something like that happens, scholars raise their eyebrows. Well, you can compare the description of Goliath's armor with the description of Achilles' armor. And they're, especially if you use like the Greek Septuagint, they're actually using some of the same words in here, not just a similar description. They're using this same description. They're using, similar or in some cases identical words. They're copying from the works of Homer, which actually pops up quite often in the Bible. The Gospel of Mark, half of it is about Odysseus. It's crazy. But there's which that's one of the things I love about Judaism. Jewish scholars, they dig into stuff like this.
Yes.
It's like fully a third of the material that I read for my research into the Old Testament comes from these Jewish guys who have dedicated their life to understanding the Jewish scriptures. That's one of the things I love about them. They don't shy away from the fact that the Old Testament is built on older myths. They're like, oh yeah, so let's talk about Moses and Osiris. And I'm like, damn. I love old Jewish scholars because they bring some serious knowledge to the table.
Indeed. And they're really serious and into doing that too. And it's funny because I met one when I lived over in Israel. He was just starting out as becoming a biblical scholar. And I asked him, I said, well, what's your take on all this? Like, do you believe this stuff? He goes, oh, no. For me, it's just stories, right? But there's things you can learn from the stories.
Yeah.
Basically. And he considered himself to be fairly secular anyway, so he wasn't even sure if he still believed in a God of any kind. So
I saw a poll a few years ago, maybe Pew Research, I can't remember. But this poll, it had a breakdown of, like, by faith, how many people who identify with this faith actually believe in a deity. Mm-hmm. And it was something like 80% of Jews were atheist.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Yeah, it blew my mind. But then I'm like, that's why they're so open about writing this stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like they're culturally Jewish. I mean, it's tied up with their identity. It's an ethnic group. It is part of who they are. That doesn't mean they have to believe it.
That's right.
And many of them don't.
That's right.
So yeah.
I mean, I still go over to my sister's or my mom's place when we're having the holiday meals and stuff like that. Of course, my sister gets a little upset at me when especially on Passover, when we're reading the Haggadah and reading the story of Passover, and it comes my part to read, and I'm reading the stuff and occasionally rolling my eyes like, this is all fucking bullshit. And she just gives me these looks like that, kind of thing.
Yeah. I several years ago, after my parents found out that I was atheist, I was over there one day for Christmas, and I guess they decided they were going to put me on the spot, and they're like, so Jason, why don't you lead us in the blessing? And so, like, the whole family's there, the extended family, everyone's looking at me, and it's basically like, do I just say a prayer or do I act like an asshole? And I split the difference. I said, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, whoever eats the fastest gets the most. Amen. Half the family laughed, half the family scowled at me. Everyone started eating, and my parents never asked me to pray again.
So it worked then.
Yeah. And my mom got it. She's like, that's not an appropriate prayer. I'm like, you taught it to me. You taught me that prayer years ago. It's your fault.
Busted.
Yeah. It's like, she's like, I wasn't being serious. I was like, neither was I.
Yeah, you asked for it. So
yeah. It's like, I mean, hey, it's what you wanted. You wanted to make a scene. And I squirmed out of it.
Then there was one less present under the tree.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we've come to like this little understanding. I basically, I don't talk about the Bible to them. They don't talk about religion to me, and we just kind of pretend it's not an issue, and everyone more or less gets along.
That's good.
Yeah.
So they don't really have any hang-ups about you being atheist and stuff like that?
I mean, my mom desperately wishes I would start going to church. She's convinced that that I know there's a God. I know that God is real. I just need to open my heart and accept him into my life. And every now and then she'll just like send me some random religious book, but it's never a useful book. Like, it's never one from my Amazon wish list. It's like, it's not written by some PhD. It's like some priest telling you how to get your faith back. And it's like, he doesn't even cite any of his sources. This is garbage. And so I just toss them aside.
All you gotta say is I didn't lose my faith. I threw it the fuck away.
Yeah. It's like, She's like, you need to open your Bible. I'm like, that's what killed it. I've read it several times. I've got like 5 versions on the shelf behind me.
Yeah.
I'm trying my best to learn how to read Greek so I can read the old manuscripts in the actual original language.
We have. It's not the original language of the Bible. They don't even know exactly.
Right. Yeah, we have original. That's something people need to understand about the Bible. We have originals of exactly 0 books of the Bible.
That's right. They're all copies of copies of copies.
And we don't we can't even date these books. Like the closest we can come is like the writings of Paul. And it's like, about the middle of the 1st century, but maybe a little later. Gospel of Mark. Yeah, there's about a 50-year gap of, it could be anywhere in there. And then the Old Testament. It's like, oh yeah. Oh man. I dated a couple Catholic girls. That never worked out. So yeah. I'll stick with my crazy atheist chick. She's a lot cooler.
Awesome.
I love you, babe.
Oh, my friend, we have come. Well, we've actually gone past the hour, and that's totally fine.
I don't know how to give short answers, man. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I like it. It's all good. It was a great conversation. Well, mostly you, of course, but that's the whole point of these is for you to tell your story of how things went for you, how you found your way out, and all that stuff. And I appreciate you coming on today, dude.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I appreciate you asking me on here.
Well, my pleasure. And we're going to do an after party. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I don't have to work tomorrow, so I can stay up all night and keep my girlfriend awake. So,
well, we're not going to be up all night, but we'll go for an hour for sure. So yeah, thanks again, dude, for joining me. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I very much enjoyed listening to this conversation. Well, being a part of it, actually. But anyways, guys, if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, don't forget to hit that like button down below. And if you're new to the channel and you are interested in these kinds of stories, feel free to subscribe. We're going to do an after party. So if anyone would like to join us for the after party, you can let me know either via Twitter or Facebook if you're not on Twitter. I'll have to open up my Facebook page. It's not currently open, but that's fine. I'll do so. And I want to thank all my wonderful patrons. You guys are part of the reason why this show keeps going, is it helps me reinvest into better equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So also thanks to my gorilla buddy who has sent me a few of the things off my wish list. One of them has showed up so far, and we're still waiting on a couple more. I'm going to have little foamy things for my microphone very soon and stuff like that, which will be really cool. And like I always say at the end of these live streams, guys, with the whole COVID thing going on right now, remember to be safe and be well, and above all, be kind. And like the late, great Christopher Hitchens once said, it's called faith because it's not knowledge. And we'll see you guys next time.